Thanks for the opportunity to speak to you. Hopefully this will be a bit of a journey. I have a couple of points, I suppose, to say. Everything begins with a beginning, how I became a qualified engineer, various projects that I've worked on over the years from 1972 through to, just before Christmas. A role as operations manager in the Victorian Railways, which in those days was called the Public Transport Corporation. The new phase I've called it, which is my later years, and questions. But I'm happy to take questions and clarifications at any time. So that's the outline of what I'd like to talk about this morning. So, the beginning, I began my working career as an apprentice with Victorian Railways at Newport workshops. And in those days, we had to sign on at Flinders Street Station, the ballroom. This is day one, 20th of January 1964. There was a special train from Flinders Street Station to Newport workshops, and we went to Newport workshops to be welcomed by the welcoming committee, which consisted of all the workers standing in front of the workshop saying, "You'll be sorry, you'll be sorry." So that was our introduction to work on day one. In those days, we had a quarter fare discount. We had to pay for our travel. These days, of course, everybody in public transport these days has free transport all the way through. So I started as an apprentice electrical fitter. The Victorian Railways had its own technical college. I was one of a group of 30 electrical trades apprentices, but in total there were close to 200 in the railways. Now that wasn't only the railways. The Gas and Fuel Corporation, the State Electricity Commission, all took in apprentices of those numbers. So really the state was actually training the next level of tradespeople all through. Now that's changed dramatically in our lifetimes. So that was how it was, and there's my certificate of proficiency in electrical fitting, which I don't try me on it today, but anyway, that was at the time. I was fortunate after 2 years to be offered a scholarship to study electrical engineering at what was then Footscray Technical College, which then became Footscray Institute of Technology, which today is Victoria University. And for the princely sum there, I think it was $1,014 for the year, and the grade of an apprentice student. And of course the surety was, my father had to provide the surety. That's when I went to what was then, as I said, Footscray Technical College, later the Institute and so on. One of the tools of the trade, which some people already recognise from just talking around, was the slide rule. Now the slide rule was a precursor to the calculators, but you've got very good at using this for multiplication and division because you used it every day of the week for 4 years. So you could very accurate, very quick and very accurate with it. But it was, we forget there was no such thing as a push-button calculator. They just didn't exist. So if we wanted to multiply or divide, this is what we had to do. And 2 times 5 is 10, but 20 times 5 is not 10. So you had to carry the numbers in your head. So if you're multiplying 2 by 5 or 20 by 5, to write down the rate, you had to carry it in your head, the multipliers all the way through. As I said, if you did it every day of the week for 4 years, at the end of the time you got very good at doing it. So, excuse me. So moving on, after 4 years at Footscray Institute of Technology, I was awarded a diploma in electrical engineering, qualified on the 1st of January 1970. And at that time, there were 2 streams of qualifications for engineers. There was the technical colleges, which had the diplomas, and the universities, of course, had the degrees. But both of them were assessed by the Institution of Engineers as to their capability of being accepted as a member of the institution. In actual fact, I did what was called the 65 revised course, which we were the first guinea pigs, if I could use that, and it was only when the institution examined our course content all the way through until 1969 that they agreed, yes, these students have got the competency to be admitted as members of the institution. A fellow of the 1999 there, and if you're around long enough, you get lots of letters after your name, but we can talk about those another time if that's needed. So now, just to move into some projects. Hopefully you'll find some of these interesting. So Melbourne Underground Rail Loop, the Hitachi trains, they were the new trains from 1973, the Cummins trains, new ones from 1982, cancellation of a Harris train refurbishment contract, which maybe people don't know too much about, but I could talk about that. The North-South Light Rail, which is one of the real success stories, and Jolimont decentralisation, which I think was another success story. So there's some of the things that I was involved with over the time. So if I start with the Melbourne Underground Rail Loop, I was at the right place at the right time. I had 2 years' experience as an engineer. And then the government decided they wanted to build the Melbourne Underground Rail Loop. And where I was in overhead design, I got the job of actually doing the estimates for all the staging work for the overhead wiring. So it wasn't just the overhead wiring in the tunnels, it was the overhead wiring for all the stage works that went on between Flinders Street and Richmond, because the tunnels went under the existing railway at that time, and similarly at North Melbourne. So the reason I have this little sketch, the rolled up paper at the bottom, in those days they came as drawings. So the drawings were that wide, and I had a roll of them 200 mil in diameter, or maybe 8 inches if you wanted inches. So how do you deal with that? Well, the only sensible way to deal with that is to take it home and put it on your dining room table. So for 6 weeks, I worked out all the staging and got all the costing done for that. And then after the 6 weeks, the government decided they wanted to actually change the connections at the Richmond end. So I had a week to revise a section of it. The advice in 1980 was that they were still using my estimates, just put CPI onto them. So I managed to get that right. But that was, as a young engineer, it was a very valuable experience. It was valuable in that it was a hard contract between the Victorian Railways and the consortium that was building the Underground Rail Loop. There was no gentleman's agreement. This was real hard cash, and if the numbers were wrong, well, you had to carry the losses with that. But as it turned out, it worked quite well. The other bit of this task was to design the actual electrical layout. So Flinders Street Station was there because the tracks were there previously, but there was a tie station and at Spencer Street and another one at Museum, which was a consequence of the design that I put in place for that overhead to actually power those trains. So the tie stations are protection areas. They have circuit breakers that protect the track section. The substation is the same thing, but it actually has a rectifier to power the overhead. Okay. This next one is just a shot of the overhead being erected in the tunnel, one of the tunnels there in the mid-1970s. What you can't see, there's another vehicle ahead of this one, which is actually tensioning the wire, and what these chaps are doing is actually the contact wire, which the train gets its power from, is supported by a catenary. So these chaps are actually connecting the contact wire and the catenary. So that's the work that was going on there. The next project is the Hitachi trains, but I want to start rather than the trains, but electrical testing division. After I was in overhead design, I was moved to electrical testing. Sorry. I'll try that again. Is that working?
Yep.
Yeah, thank you. So electrical, I was moved from the overhead design to the electrical testing division. In those days, the deputy head of the branch, every October, come and see me. I could may as well come and see him. Mr. Rudolph was his name. Although the electrical branch always had first name basis for the engineers, the head of the branch to the junior engineer was always on a first name basis. That was just the way they ran that particular division. But come and see me in October, and look, you'll be here. You'd be right to report over there on Monday morning, wouldn't you? So that was there was no worries about developing your career. You were just told that that's where your next assignment is. So I was moved to electrical testing, and the reason I was moved there was to introduce the Hitachi trains. The Hitachi trains were manufactured by Martin and King at Somerton, and the railways had two teams at the end of the production line, a mechanical engineering team and an electrical engineering team. And my role was to actually write the standards and the procedures, the test procedures for the electrical acceptance of those trains. So I worked on about the first 10 cars myself with testing electricians, as we call them, and then trained them up.
Sorry, why are they called Hitachi trains? Were they provided by Japan?
The electrical equipment was Japanese, yes. Yeah. So the motor control system was Japanese. The braking system was Westinghouse brake, because that was the standard of the day. But yeah, it was the car was an Hitachi design with Hitachi traction system. Yeah. Okay. So at the end of the production line, we had these two teams, as I said. So after I wrote the standards and trained up the testing electricians, I then moved on to other things. But as I said here, it was the electrical engineers' playground. We had a fantastic complete range of anything that in the railways that wouldn't work. So, and you've got to go back and remember, photocopiers were rare, if not existent. But the railways had its own printing works. So if there was a printing machine that decided not to work, electrical testing go and fix it. We had flash butt welders. I don't know if you've ever seen a picture of it, but welding the rails together, in a workshop. These actual monstrous machines actually weld the rails together electrically. One of those didn't work. Well, go fix it. And if we couldn't fix it ourselves, we'd actually get around a table, the engineers in that division, and we'd actually work until we actually nutted it out. So it was, as I say, a fantastic exposure as a young engineer. A lot of good engineering work, but also some very good management work, in that the team was 110 people overall, so it wasn't a large division, but we did have a range of people. We had a production line for overhauling relays, which had 19 ladies on it, who were actually rebuilding relays that were needed overhaul. So that sort of thing. So that's where I got involved with managing ladies at one stage. I think that's probably enough on that one. This shows an absolute lack of imagination in terms of titles. Manager, project management. No, I didn't make it up, but that was it. I found a handsome photo just to remind myself what I used to look like. And the BV stands for brake van, which means that's the authority to actually travel with the driver or the guard in position of one of those cars. So it was in this role that I did a lot of development work on various projects. The Melbourne Underground, the Jollymont decentralisation, which was a removal of the first bits and pieces of the railway yards along Wellington Road South, the North-South Light Rail project, the smaller projects, bridge replacements and things like that, the Harris Train upgrade project I mentioned before, and a negotiation on extension of the ComEng contract too, which originally was 50 trains. After my involvement in this, we went up to 95. So the North-South Light Rail project, as it was called, the Liberal government, coalition government at the time, had accepted a recommendation that the Port Melbourne and St Kilda railway line should be closed because they just weren't being used. There wasn't the number there. Change of government, the Labor government came in and said, no, we won't close it, we'll convert it to the tramways. So my role in that was to actually look at the engineering side of what needed to be changed. So it was a change of gauge because the railway runs on broad gauge, the tramways run on standard gauge, the rail profiles are different. The traction system is 1500 volt DC from the railways, it was 600 volts for the tramways, and you had clearance problems, anything that you can think about, physical interfaces between trains that was different to the trams. So platforms were changed and all that sort of thing. So my role was in specifying, getting the grips with all of that. And I was assisted by a planning manager who's still a colleague of mine, we had a wonderful character building exercise of going along to what was then the Railway Transport Committee, which comprised the union representatives of the Labor Party. And I was there as the railway person saying, well, these railway lines are going to disappear and they're going to become tramways. Needless to say, I wasn't all that popular with my railway colleagues after that, but I got over it and so did they. The outcome of this project was absolutely fantastic. The ridership, once the trams went in, was triple what it was on the railways. Immediately. It didn't grow over time, it just took off. So it actually an incredibly successful project in terms of delivering the service at a much more economic basis, but again, the ridership actually showed it really was the right decision. I'll talk a bit about Jolimont decentralisation. I have difficulty in finding a good photograph, but this is a very early one. I'm sure you'll recognise that the gas and fuel buildings aren't there because I'm sure most of us will remember that they used to be there and now they're gone. But this is before they were actually built. Up here is the workshops, and I'll talk about that later. And this area here, which I couldn't get a photo of going forward, but this was the area alongside Wellington Parade South, which was the area that I was charged in releasing under this particular project. So the concept of the land where the railways were storing trains of having a better and higher use than storing trains was quite obvious. But it had been around off and on from the 1970s. But in the mid-80s, again, it got listed, and this time it actually came out with partly successful. Two Director Generals of Transport, and you'll understand why I put that there as I go through this next little bit. So I had the job of writing the business case. I didn't write cabinet papers because nobody writes cabinet papers, they just automatically exist. But anyway, cabinet did actually consider and give the Public Transport Corporation, as it was then. Sorry, that was the Met. It was the Metropolitan Transit Authority at that stage. So we had $42 million from the Treasury for building a depot at Epping, which was to enable releasing some of the maintenance tasks from the Jolimont area, and $4 million to clear out the land because there were 20 trains parked in that area, and that had to be cleared, contamination, all that sort of thing. So I had that. Now the Director General at the time really said that there's no way that he'd trust the railway engineers to do this because they just wouldn't do it on time. It'll all run crazy and all that sort of thing. So at his insistence, went to the market and a consortium was selected to actually manage the project. So then the project commenced, but then a new Director General of Transport was appointed. So here I am this particular day in the office with the team that we're setting up. And this particular new Director General of Transport, he would do his networking lunchtime. And this particular afternoon, I get a phone call from him saying, "What's that consortium done for you?" And I said, "Well, we've established a project office. We're mobilising. We've got some of our early clearance contracts. We're preparing all that sort of stuff." The response was, "Sack him." Well, sack him. So if the Director General gives you the direction to sack him, I then went and saw my boss and said to my boss, "I've just had this phone call, interesting phone call." And he said, "What is it?" And I told him, and he said, "Well, you better do what you're told." So doing what I was told, I did sack the project director, who wasn't all that happy, of course. He was an American chap brought in specifically to lead the consortium. Anyway, he was left, and for my sins, I was then appointed as the Director of Jolimont Decentralisation. Now, this caused me a little bit of consternation because having gone out there and fought to get the money, I now had to actually deliver it for what I'd asked for. So there was no one else. It was very, very easy to find out where the accountability was. But with a lot of assistance, I managed to deliver the project on time and on budget. So it was a good outcome, a very good outcome. The individual members of the consortium I kept in the team because I didn't want to, they had the skills that I needed, but equally the firms were there. There was an issue that, yes, that they were looking for some compensation if we'd thrown them off the job, and that we avoided that. What it really got down to, while the consortium was there as a single entity, they had not agreed the risk-return trade-offs between the partners. So that's really what was underneath the Director General's comment of sack 'em, because they couldn't get themselves together to actually come to that arrangement as a consortium. So by taking it in-house with myself running it, they then had individual employees contracting to me, so they got their margins on that way. So we avoided quite a little bit of angst and probably some legal action as well. Jim Kennan, as Minister for Transport, opened the Epping Depot on the 15th of March 1990. The next project was the Harris train refurbishment. This is a story of government really not listening to the engineers and particularly the train drivers. These were the Harris trains, the blue ones. So these were actually reworked, but what the proposal was to make them into an air-conditioned train. So the original Harris trains were introduced for the first ones for the 1956 Olympics. What this project was actually about was to air condition them. So they put 2 air conditioners in each carriage, and underneath the motor cars there was a new machine to actually provide the power to drive the air conditioners. What that did was to increase the weight or the mass of those trains, but there was no changes to the powering and no changes, more importantly for the train drivers, to the braking. So they accelerated slower than they used to, and more importantly, the braking was much reduced. So the drivers had lots of issues in getting used to the much slower braking rate, because if your maximum braking rate is fixed and you put more load on it, of course, it doesn't perform as well. So I got involved with the team of 3 of us who were appointed to actually work through what to do about this, and what came out of it was that these carriages were actually reworked and became part of the regional fleet, and were towed around by locomotives, and there's still some of them today in use today. And the equipment that had been ordered, the air conditioners, because the project didn't go completely as to the scope that was originally planned, air conditioners and the machines, power machines, were actually cascaded into another generation of the conventional fleet. So what that actually did from the overall net point of view was to completely remove the last of the wooden body trains, the Tate trains. The issue with the Tate trains, with the Melbourne Underground Rail Loop, was nobody was prepared to run a wooden body train into an underground railway. Nobody does that. And that was one of my earlier jobs going back another part of the career, was actually to chase down the operators and make sure that their scheduling of their trains, that the wooden body trains only ran on the surface and never got into the underground.
Didn't mean to interrupt, but the Tate train, were they the Red Rattlers?
The Red Rattlers, as they're called, yes. Named after Commissioner Tate, yes.
Yeah.
So, sorry, what did I do? The comment on the 45 trains really was, if you like, took the whole network into what was for the first time a modern train fleet. We had Hitachis, which were not air conditioned, but from the 1970s, and the Commons from the 1982s.
Does that mean 45 carriages, 45 engines?
45 6-carriage trains.
So a 6-carriage unit.
The units are actually 3, they're built as a unit of 3 carriage, but I always talk, because I became an operator, I always talked about 6-car trains as a train. But the basic building block is a motor, trailer, motor unit, which is coupled to its neighbour. So that's where we get the 6 cars from. So 45 6-car trains.
You need to know that.
Yeah. Change of thrust here. So away from the engineering to operations manager. So two roles just to talk about here briefly. One was the Group General Manager Train Fleet, and the second was the General Manager Passenger Train and Coach Operations. So, having built the Epping train depot, I was now appointed as responsible for maintaining all the train fleets, all the passenger train fleet in the state. So that was the metropolitan trains, but also all the regional trains. I did not have responsibility for the locomotives, but any self-propelled vehicle in the regional fleet, and of course I said all the metropolitan fleet, I was responsible for the maintenance of all of those. So here, there's a picture at Epping. This is that's a com-eng train on the jacking system. There's myself underneath the train. They're the jacks that lift the train. So it's about a 48-ton train carriage sitting on those jacks, and that's the way modern maintenance is done on rolling stock, because all the bits that are important are really underneath the train. So wheels, axles, the power equipment, all that sort of equipment is actually underneath it. So having safe access to that equipment is really quite critical. These systems, they can actually put a stand beside the train here and lower that bogie, so you'll actually take out one. If there was an effective motor in this bogie, they could actually drop that out and replace it. And I think they could probably do that in an hour or so. Now, previously to that, everything was lifted with cranes separately, overhead cranes, much bigger structure to hold it, of course. As I said, 48 tonnes in one individual car, and they could only do it as an individual car. So, again, that's a pretty broad role. Depots at Jollymont, as shown before. I also had Dudley Street Depot, which is still there. If you know Dudley Street, the railway depot there. South Dynon had the interstate and the regional maintenance done at South Dynon, and also the Epping depot that I just actually built. So, there's more. This was one of the most interesting and challenging jobs that I had in my career. For 4 years, I was General Manager of Passenger Train and Coach Operations. Now, this was if you go back in history, we had Victorian Railways, then there was the Metropolitan Transit and the State Transit Authorities. They were then put together into the Public Transport Corporation, and it was in this arrangement of the Public Transport Corporation that the railways were put back together. Okay. They've been broken apart since, but we can talk about that later if needed. So in this role, I was responsible for all passenger movements in the state and the road coaches that interfaced with the trains. The road coaches really ran themselves. They were based in the region. Everybody knew everybody. The coaches were timed to run and meet the trains. There was no other routes that they ran, so it was all, once the contract was in place, it really ran itself because people knew each other, and there wasn't the freedom for the buses to go wandering all over the countryside. They had a set time, pick up people here, run this time, and meet the train at that station. So it really ran itself. Didn't take much effort at all. I kept the group manager rolling stock role because I had managers in each of the depots, and putting another person over the top I didn't think was necessary, and it also gave me the ability to really get in there when I wanted to get involved into the details. The state went into recession, you might remember, and at one stage of a fleet of 150 trains, I had 10 of them parked because they weren't needed for services. We forget just how dire the state was at that time. It really was very dire. But I had to live through that. And the next step, of course, was the change in the government with the coalition, the Kennett government coming to power. But just a couple other points on the General Manager Passenger Train and Coach. As I said, passenger trains, road coaches, 2,500 staff. I had 800 train drivers in the metropolitan area and 500 yards. There were 320 in maintenance in the Jollymont workshops. and I can't recall the other numbers. But just with that, I've got over 1,000 with those numbers I've just said there. So it was really quite an expansive organisation. The breadth of control was quite good because I did have good people in the areas, and my operations people were actually brilliant. I had a chief operator for the Metropolitan Road Services and a chief operator for the regional services. A couple other things, purchased 22 Sprinter trains. These were single carriage trains that could be operated up to 6 or 8. They still run up to Bendigo and other regions out there. The trial double-decker train. There's a story behind this, in that I get called to the Minister's office, and I go to the Minister's office and he is there with his advisors and with my union colleagues from the railways, and I'm told that there's an offer that we could have a double-deck train that is, for a trial, and would I support that? Well, my political antenna was such that I thought, well, yes, I could support that, because there's no way I wasn't. It was going to be done anyway. So, but what really got behind it was that the people in Gninins in Newcastle were looking for an opportunity to manufacture more rolling stock. We did get that one train into service. It did run for a number of years. The benefit of it is that they will actually carry about 40% more customers for the same length of train. The disadvantage is that in a metropolitan area, the dwell time, people getting up and downstairs and in and out of the doors at the station stops, just increases. So nobody these days will build a double-deck train for a metropolitan service, and the latest trains that have been introduced into Sydney are not double-deck, they are single-deck, because you can board people quicker with a single-deck car than a double-deck. So while you get more people per train with a double-deck, you get less trains per hour because the people boarding and loading takes up the time.
So, excuse me, so you're saying that Sydney, where I used to live but haven't been there for a while, don't have double deckers anymore?
No, they've still got the existing fleet, but the most recent trains they've bought have all been single deck. Yes. Yeah.
So 40% more people to be carried is not better than a slight delay at the platform.
It's the number of trains per hour you can put through.
Yeah.
So do you want 20 trains per hour or 16 trains per hour? So it's the trains per hour is really that's where the equation changes. If Sydney, what they call the Oscars, the outer suburban cars, running up to the Blue Mountains and so on, work perfectly because the station spacings are so far apart. Typically in an old railway like we have here, the original station spacings was 1 mile, 1.6 kilometres. So at that spacing, you have difficulties. But if your if your station spacing is 5 or 10 kilometres, the double deckers pay off. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So it makes a difference. These last 2 points here are a bit, I'll talk about them, but Vanilla is a particularly a sad incident, but it had a railway consequence that I had to really fight for. A strange couple, she's with the children on the train going from Melbourne to Sydney. He's in the hotel at Vanilla. The train comes in and he actually murders his estranged wife in front of kids and 60 people. At 11 o'clock at night. So I get involved with, have we got the police are involved, yes, have we got the counselling people, have we got the buses to take the people who are affected to Sydney and all of that. But the police rightly declared a crime scene, but what they declared a crime scene was not only the carriage, but they declared Vanilla railway station as a crime scene. For a railwayman, the difficulty with that was there had already been freight trains from Melbourne and Sydney dispatched. And if that train was sitting at Vanilla, we could end up with a situation we couldn't actually get the train through. And that would have meant, if you send a train out to a destination that can't get there, you would have to go and get it and take it back to the origin again. It's the days before mobile phones. We had a house phone. So here I am sitting on the side of the bed yelling at the police and yelling at train controllers and anybody else that train had to be moved. And by 3 o'clock in the morning it was moved. So just a consequence of, eventually convincing the police, yes, the train's a crime scene, but you cannot have the platform as a crime scene because nothing had occurred at the platform itself. But it's sort of a consequence that you don't really think about until you actually hit in the spot and saying, well, I've got the train controller saying, well, what do I do now? Do I stop those trains? So the answer, no, you can't. If you do stop them, what's the next move? Does the train sit there until we get a relief crew come down 3 hours later? It just goes on and gets very complicated. And the state recession, as I touched on before, was really the last bit of which again, just thinking back, there was some pretty torrid times around there. The Kennett government. So the Kennett government came with a rail reform package, as they called it, and I was still in the role of General Manager, Passenger Train Coach, but two things I just wanted to touch on briefly was the closure of Jollymont workshops and the single person operation of trains. So another Director General this time had come and see me. All right, okay, John, yes. Got a question for you. Can we close the Jollymont train maintenance depot? And I said, John, I don't know. But I'll work it out. So being what I thought was a responsible person, I said to my assistant, the boss has asked me to do something. So I packed up my goods and I went down to Billy Bell's pub in South Melbourne, where I had a later engagement that evening, and sat there at the counter with the beer and worked out that the Epping train depot, which was only in those days only working 1 day shift a week, in other words 5 shifts, if that was moved to having 19 shifts, that could maintain the entire train fleet that was running at that time. So why 19 shifts? Because you have Sunday morning off, you have Saturday night off and Sunday morning off, and that so that people get the weekend breaks. But 19 shifts out of an available 21 is an efficient way to actually do that sort of work. So it did come out that yes, it could be done. So I wrote the recommendation, and I think it was April of '93 that the depot was closed. As I said before, there were 320 in that role, that maintenance depot, and those jobs all went. The other thing that the Kennett government did was to force in the single person operation of trains. Labor had actually tried this a decade earlier, and because their internals, what had happened was the intent was, yes, we'll take the guards off the train. That was fought politically, and that didn't occur. But you'll recall that there were trams that were locked up in the city. So when they couldn't take the guards off the trains, the bright people said, I know what we'll do. We'll take the conductors off the trams. And that was ended up with that situation where the trams were parked in the city. So that's really what the background to that. And the first train ran on the Williamstown line in September 1993. So we're getting on a bit of time. So just if I skip over the next couple, if that's okay. This is the new phase where I started my own consulting business, and I work for Codex, Department of Transport, Department of Infrastructure, and Metro Trains. So, and I've been recently, and I still consult on Metro Trains these days. So, Codex introducing these trains, $500 million worth as General Manager Technical. Department of Infrastructure, Department of Transport, various projects here, but just the money that's involved in this sort of stuff is just incredible. So I led the team that came up with the concept for the regional rail link. Craig application, 115 million. the E-Class tram, I led the team that wrote the technical spec for that. We had 50 E-Class trams and a new rebuild of the Preston depot, 809 million. And trains these days are about 20 million a piece. So, am I right to keep going for another couple of minutes?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, thanks, Dave. The last thing I've been working on with for about the last 10 years off and on has been the Metro Tunnel project, which has just opened recently. And 5 stations there, and if you haven't seen them, they're certainly worth a look. The reason these things are so large is that to build the stations, they tunnel down from the top. So they have to take all the soil out to actually get down to the right level. But the thing then is, you don't want to bring soil back in. So it gives the architects great freedom to actually build these great arches and things, because economically, it's far more economically to actually have the open space there than to truck back soil to put it back on top for no real good reason. So that's why we end up with such big edifices. I thought of just a little bit of electrical engineering because I could. Electricity and magnetism always go together. Every electrical circuit produces a magnetic field, and this is the sort of thing that I take junior engineers through. So I don't know if this makes sense, but this is a substation. This is a substation, a train, and the train, of course, gets its power from the substations and back through the rails, both ways. But due to the current flow, we get magnetic fields produced. Okay. Now, we never feel magnetic fields. We live in a magnetic field called the Earth. But if you've got your compass with you on your phone and you're in the right place, you can actually measure, you can see those fields change your compass. Okay. So the reason I put that there is because at Parkville, there are sensitive receivers that get affected by magnetic fields. And here we have the overhead bars and the rail returns. And over here, a sensitive receiver. Now this one is actually a linear accelerator at Peter Mac Cancer Centre. And I was involved in working through what the various fields might be. And here's just one of my hand calculations, which shows on this example that 11.2 microtesla was the issue. So at the end of the day, what's happened is the original design for the traction system did not cancel out the fields effectively. So through major redesign, the fields cancel these days. So now we actually have it, that the system works efficiently and there's no impact on any of the scientific or medical equipment in that area. So along the way, last slide, Victorian Railways, Metropolitan Transit Authority, Public Transport Corporation, Connex, Department of Infrastructure and Transport, Metro Trains Melbourne. And I thought maybe if I look back at just at a high level, an engineer, project manager, operations manager, project manager, and then back to engineering. So, sorry for running over, but thank you for listening.
We got any questions?
I've got one question.
Yes, Diana.
When you talked about changing from trains to trams and the number of people using them increased by 60%, why?
Well, I think it was a matter of the capture area. What I didn't say, Diana, before that was that we were running basically a 10-minute service on the St Kilda line, and said, okay, well, it's going to close. So we ran then a 31-minute service, and the number of people didn't change. So they were sort of, thank you. Thank you. So they were basically well aligned. The trams were, people just jumped to the trams, and I think it was, just I don't really know why, but that was it. The ridership tripled immediately. Yeah. Yes.
Why was Spencer Street Station called Southern Cross?
Because the Labor government at the time thought it was a good thing to do.
Why didn't they change Spencer Street?
Sorry?
Why didn't they change?
I've got no idea. Let me stay as an engineer rather than a politician.
All right, anything else? Okay, well, Pat, thanks very much for taking us on that journey. Very, very interesting to get that perspective on our railway system and how it's evolved. I think it's going back to the red rattlers, which we can all remember, up until the current train.